Imagine standing in a courtroom, your intelligence and dignity mocked simply because of the way you speak. That's exactly what happened to one black scholar, dismissed and humiliated by a judge who thought he was untouchable. But when this scholar calmly cited an obscure, centuries-old law, what happened next left the entire courtroom speechless. Stick around because you won't believe how this incredible showdown ends. Tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will leave you speechless. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as Amari Taylor stepped to the center, his hands gripping a worn leather briefcase. The room was vast, its high ceilings adorned with carved mahogany, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and the sharp tang of polished brass. Rows of spectators whispered behind him, their voices a low hum of doubt and curiosity. Amari could feel their eyes, some filled with hope, others skepticism. He squared his shoulders and let out a steady breath, the weight of his community resting on him like a mantle. Judge Nathaniel Prescott leaned back in his chair, his black robe draped loosely over his shoulders. His eyes, cold and sharp, appraised Amari with a thin veneer of professionalism that couldn't quite mask his disdain. Prescott's voice broke through the room like the crack of a whip. "Mr. Taylor, I trust you'll keep this presentation brief and intelligible. We wouldn't want anyone losing track of what you're trying to say." A ripple of laughter followed, faint but sharp enough to sting. Amari's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. His voice, warm and rich with the cadence of his southern roots, rolled out evenly. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the law itself isn't brief, nor does it cater to convenience. I'll be as clear as necessary to defend my case." The judge's lips curled into a faint smirk, and he motioned for Amari to proceed. The courtroom fell silent again, though the tension simmered beneath the surface like a storm waiting to break. Amari opened his briefcase, pulling out neatly organized documents, each carefully annotated. His fingers brushed against the edges of an old photograph tucked into the corner of the case. It was a picture of him as a boy, sitting beside his late mentor, Mr. Jameson, in a cramped but welcoming library. The memory steadied him. Amari glanced at the opposing counsel, Margaret Hollis, a sleek figure with sharp eyes that mirrored the judge's condescension. She tilted her head slightly, her confidence unshaken, as if she already knew how this would end. Amari began to lay out the foundation of his argument, explaining how the eviction notice served to his community violated multiple procedural laws. He spoke with precision, his voice unwavering, but with each point, the judge interrupted with curt questions. "Mr. Taylor," Prescott said, his tone oozing impatience, "I fail to see how this is relevant to the matter at hand. Let's not clutter the court's time with unnecessary tangents." Amari paused, locking eyes with the judge. "Your Honor," he replied calmly, "I believe you'll find these so-called tangents are the heart of this case." The room seemed to hold its breath. Prescott raised an eyebrow, his smirk deepening, but he motioned for Amari to continue. Amari pressed on, carefully outlining the injustices at play. He spoke not just of legal technicalities, but of the lives impacted. Families forced out of homes they had lived in for generations, elders who would lose not just a roof over their heads, but the memories etched into every corner of their walls. As Amari painted this picture, his accent became more pronounced, a reminder of where he had come from and who he was fighting for. Prescott leaned forward, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the edge of his desk. "Mr. Taylor," he interjected again, "while your passion is commendable, I suggest you stick to the facts. This court isn't here to entertain a narrative." A few snickers escaped from the gallery, but Amari held firm. "The facts, Your Honor, are that this case is about more than numbers on a ledger. It's about a community's right to exist, and the law recognizes that, whether it's convenient for some or not." The judge's smile faltered for a split second, but he quickly masked it with an air of superiority. Amari could feel the tide in the room pulling against him, the weight of doubt pressing harder. But beneath that doubt, he knew there was an opportunity, a moment waiting to be seized. He just had to find it. As the courtroom settled into a tense stillness, Amari could feel the weight of judgment hanging in the air. Judge Prescott leaned back in his chair, his gavel resting loosely in one hand as if daring Amari to misstep. Margaret Hollis, ever poised, flipped through her meticulously organized notes, her faint smile suggesting she was already 2 steps ahead. Amari adjusted his tie, a small gesture to ground himself, and continued. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but firm. "The eviction notices served to the residents of Eastwood Heights violate Article 27, Section 14 of this state's housing statute. The law clearly states that no eviction can proceed without—" Prescott cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Mr. Taylor, I'm familiar with the housing statute," he said sharply, his tone laced with condescension. "What I'm not seeing is how this pertains to your claim of procedural violations. The developers followed the proper channels. Your argument is tenuous at best." Amari resisted the urge to clench his fists. He knew this tactic all too well, discredit the speaker to undermine the argument. Instead, he met the judge's gaze head-on. "If I may, Your Honor, I'll demonstrate precisely how these channels were manipulated to circumvent the law." Hollis smirked, leaning slightly forward as if to challenge him. "By all means, Mr. Taylor. We're all waiting for this revelation." Amari took a deep breath and unfolded a map of Eastwood Heights, marked with dates and annotations. He placed it on the evidence table, carefully smoothing it out for everyone to see. "This map," he began, "shows the original zoning designations for Eastwood Heights before the development plans were approved. Notice the boundaries here." He pointed to the areas shaded in green. "These are legally protected residential zones." Prescott squinted, clearly uninterested. "And what's your point?" Amari's tone didn't waver. "My point, Your Honor, is that the developers redrew these boundaries without notifying the residents, effectively stripping their protections. The law requires that any changes to zoning must be disclosed in public hearings. Hearings that, as the record shows, never took place." The judge opened his mouth to respond, but Hollis was quicker. "Your Honor, this is a baseless claim," she said, her voice crisp and confident. "The zoning adjustments were approved by the City Council. There's no evidence to suggest any foul play." Amari smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hinted he was prepared for this exact rebuttal. "Actually, there is," he said, pulling out a stack of documents. "These are internal memos from the City Planning Office, obtained through a public records request. They clearly show that the developers pushed these adjustments through using private meetings that excluded any representatives from the Eastwood Heights community." A murmur rippled through the gallery, the weight of the revelation sending shockwaves through the room. Even Prescott seemed momentarily taken aback, though he quickly recovered, narrowing his eyes at Amari. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Taylor," he said slowly. "I hope you have more than speculation to back it up." "I do, Your Honor," Amari replied, his voice resolute, "and I'm prepared to submit these memos as evidence. They detail not only the private meetings, but also communications between the developers and certain members of the council, suggesting financial incentives were involved." Hollis's confident demeanor faltered for the first time. She stood abruptly, her voice sharp. "Your Honor, this is an attempt to muddy the waters. None of this is relevant to the eviction case." Prescott tapped his gavel lightly, signaling for silence. "Mr. Taylor, I'll allow the evidence, for now, but tread carefully. I won't tolerate baseless accusations in my courtroom." "Thank you, Your Honor," Amari said, his tone respectful but firm. "I assure you, this evidence speaks for itself." As the documents were passed to the judge and opposing counsel, Amari stole a quick glance at the gallery. He spotted familiar faces from the community. Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly woman who had nearly lost her home, sat clutching her purse tightly, her eyes filled with cautious hope. Amari's gaze lingered for a moment before returning to the task at hand. He had made his first crack in the armor of doubt surrounding him. But he knew this was only the beginning. Judge Prescott adjusted his glasses, his brow furrowing as he skimmed the documents Amari had submitted. The quiet rustling of papers echoed in the courtroom, punctuated by the soft clearing of throats from the gallery. Margaret Hollis flipped through her own copy with a sharp, almost surgical precision, her expression tightening with each page she read. Amari stood firm, watching Prescott closely. The judge's skepticism had given way to something more guarded, a sign that the evidence had struck a nerve. After what felt like an eternity, Prescott finally set the papers down and fixed Amari with a hard stare. "Mr. Taylor," he said slowly, "while these memos raise some questions, I don't see how they directly prove your clients were harmed. The developer's actions may have been questionable, but the eviction notices themselves appear to be legally valid." Amari nodded as if he had expected this deflection. "Your Honor, the eviction notices may seem valid on the surface, but their legitimacy is tied to the zoning adjustments, which were made under false pretenses. If the zoning changes are invalid, then the evictions cannot stand." Prescott leaned back, his fingers drumming against the armrest of his chair. "You're threading a very fine needle here, Mr. Taylor." "With all due respect, Your Honor, the law is designed to be precise," Amari replied, his tone unwavering. "And in this case, precision reveals the truth." Hollis stood, her chair scraping slightly against the floor. "Your Honor, this is a diversion. My client followed all applicable procedures. This attempt to challenge the zoning is nothing more than a desperate ploy to stall the inevitable." Amari turned to face her, his voice calm, but cutting. "Ms. Hollis, if your client's actions were as above board as you claim, why were these zoning changes pushed through without public hearings? Why were the residents of Eastwood Heights left in the dark?" Hollis opened her mouth to respond, but Amari pressed on before she could interject. "The answer is simple. They knew the community would oppose it. They knew the law would be on the side of the residents, so they circumvented it. That's not just unethical, it's illegal." The tension in the room was palpable now, the gallery hanging on every word. Prescott rubbed his temples, clearly grappling with the implications of the argument. "Mr. Taylor," he said finally, "even if I were to entertain your theory, you'd need more than a few memos to prove intent." Amari reached into his briefcase, his movements deliberate. "I anticipated as much, Your Honor," he said, pulling out a slim folder. "Which is why I've also included financial records showing unusual transactions between the developers and certain council members around the time these zoning adjustments were approved." Hollis's composure cracked visibly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Your Honor, this is absurd," she said, her voice rising slightly. "These records are irrelevant to the case at hand." Prescott held up a hand to silence her, his eyes narrowing as he gestured for the clerk to retrieve the folder. "Let's see what Mr. Taylor has brought to the table." As the documents were passed around, Amari felt the collective energy of the room shift. The gallery, once filled with quiet doubt, now seemed to pulse with anticipation. He caught Mrs. Jenkins's eye again, and this time, her expression was less guarded. There was something in her gaze, a glimmer of belief. Prescott's expression darkened as he read through the financial records. His voice was measured but firm when he spoke again. "If these documents are authentic, they raise serious questions about the integrity of the zoning process. However, this court isn't in the business of investigating corruption. That's a matter for the Ethics Board." "With respect, Your Honor," Amari replied, "the Ethics Board may address the corruption, but this court has the power to protect the people harmed by it. The residents of Eastwood Heights have already lost too much. They deserve justice now." For a moment, silence fell over the courtroom. Even Hollis seemed at a loss for words, her usual confidence replaced by a simmering frustration. Prescott leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench as he studied Amari. "You've made a compelling argument," he said at last, his tone grudging. "But compelling isn't enough. I'll allow these documents to remain in evidence for now, but I need more than speculation to overturn the evictions." Amari inclined his head. "Understood, Your Honor. I'll provide the necessary proof." As he returned to his seat, the room buzzed with low murmurs. Amari knew the path ahead was still fraught with obstacles, but for the first time, he felt the balance beginning to shift. The cracks in the opposition's armor were growing, and he was determined to break through entirely. The courtroom's atmosphere grew heavier, the tension lingering in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. Amari sat at the plaintiff's table, reviewing his notes with deliberate care, his pen tracing underlined passages in a worn legal book. Every move he made was calculated, every breath a conscious effort to project calm in the face of mounting pressure. Across the aisle, Margaret Hollis conferred with her client, her voice low but sharp, her gestures clipped. She was regrouping, recalibrating, and Amari could sense that she wasn't going to let him push the narrative much further, without a fight. Judge Prescott broke the silence, his gavel tapping lightly against the bench. "Mr. Taylor, you've presented an argument worth considering. However, the burden of proof lies squarely on your shoulders. If you're going to convince this court that the evictions are invalid, you'll need to provide evidence that directly links these alleged zoning violations to harm suffered by the residents." Amari stood, adjusting his tie. "Understood, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady. He reached for another file in his briefcase, one that held the stories he had carefully gathered from the residents of Eastwood Heights. "I'd like to call attention to the testimonies of those directly impacted by these evictions. Their experiences provide the human context that this case cannot ignore." Prescott raised a skeptical eyebrow, but motioned for him to continue. Amari approached the bench and handed over the file, which was thick with handwritten affidavits, photographs, and records. These are statements from dozens of residents, including elderly homeowners who've lived in the neighborhood for over 50 years. They detail the emotional and financial toll these evictions have taken. Many of these residents relied on the stability of their homes to support multi-generational families. Losing them would mean the destruction of an entire community. Prescott flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable, while the gallery leaned forward, drawn into the unfolding drama. Amari turned toward the spectators, addressing the court as much as he was addressing them. "Your Honor, this isn't just about property. It's about people, families, history. The developers would have this court believe these evictions are a simple matter of business. But for the residents of Eastwood Heights, this is a matter of survival." Hollis stood abruptly, her tone laced with irritation. "Your Honor, the defendant objects to this emotional grandstanding. While Mr. Taylor's passion is admirable, it has no place in a court of law." Amari turned to face her, his expression calm but resolute. "Ms. Hollis, these aren't just emotions. These are facts. Facts supported by years of records showing that these residents were promised stability and protection under the original zoning laws. Those promises were broken when the developers manipulated the system to suit their financial interests." Hollis's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, Prescott raised a hand to silence both attorneys. "Enough," he said, his voice firm. "Let's move forward. Mr. Taylor, you mentioned you have further evidence. I suggest you present it now." Amari nodded and returned to his table, pulling out a series of photographs. He walked back to the evidence table and placed them in front of the judge. "These photos show the current state of the properties slated for development. They were taken shortly before the eviction notices were served. As you can see, these homes are not abandoned or in disrepair, as the defense has implied. They are lived in, cared for, and deeply rooted in the lives of the residents." The judge studied the photographs, his lips pressing into a thin line. The images showed tidy lawns, painted fences, children's toys scattered on porches. Every detail a stark reminder that these weren't just houses, they were homes. The gallery began to stir, whispers growing louder as the weight of the evidence sank in. Amari glanced at Mrs. Jenkins again, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. He saw something in her face he hadn't seen before, a flicker of hope, fragile but real. Prescott finally set the photos down, his tone more measured than before. "Mr. Taylor, you've painted a vivid picture of the community's plight, but the defense is entitled to respond. Ms. Hollis, you may proceed." Hollis stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She didn't bother to hide her frustration as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, While the plaintiff has done an excellent job of appealing to sentiment, the law remains on our side. The zoning adjustments were approved by the appropriate authorities, and the evictions are entirely legal. The residents may find this situation unfortunate, but that doesn't make it unlawful. She turned to face Amari directly, her eyes narrowing. And as for these photographs, they prove nothing. A well-kept lawn doesn't negate a legal eviction notice. Amari didn't flinch. He let her words hang in the air for a moment before stepping forward again. "Ms. Hollis is right about one thing," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "This case is about the law, and the law, Your Honor, does not allow for the manipulation of zoning regulations to displace entire communities. The evidence speaks for itself." Prescott tapped his gavel lightly. "Enough for now. This court will take a short recess before we proceed." As the judge rose and exited the chamber, the gallery erupted into a low hum of conversation. Amari returned to his seat, his mind already racing with the next steps. The defense was on edge, but the battle was far from over. If anything, the stakes had only grown higher. The courtroom emptied slowly as spectators and legal teams shuffled out for the recess. Amari stayed behind, sitting quietly at the plaintiff's table, his thoughts racing. He flipped through his notes, his fingers brushing over the faded corners of the affidavits he had collected. The room, now mostly empty, felt cavernous, the high ceilings amplifying the silence. He took a deep breath, letting the weight of the moment sink in. This was more than just a legal battle. It was a fight for dignity, for recognition, for a community that had been written off. The creak of footsteps drew his attention. Mrs. Jenkins approached, her small frame dwarfed by the imposing courtroom. She hesitated, clutching her purse tightly before speaking in a voice tinged with both hope and uncertainty. "Mr. Taylor, you're doing so much for us, for all of us. But do you really think we can win this?" Amari stood, meeting her gaze with quiet determination. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said gently, "they're betting on us believing we can't. That's how they win. But as long as we fight, they can't ignore us. And I promise you, I'll fight until they have no choice but to listen." Her eyes welled with tears, and she nodded, her faith in him rekindled. "Thank you," she whispered before retreating to join the other residents gathered in the hallway. Amari sat down again, closing his eyes for a brief moment. The exhaustion was creeping in, but he couldn't let it show. He thought back to his mentor, Mr. Jameson, who had always seemed unshakable in moments like this. The memory of Jameson's words echoed in his mind. "The law isn't just about rules, Amari. It's about people. Never forget that." The doors to the courtroom swung open, and Margaret Hollis entered briskly, flanked by her team of assistants. She shot a glance in Amari's direction, her expression steely and composed. But there was a flicker of something else beneath the surface. Frustration, perhaps even doubt. She approached her table, whispering to one of her associates as she shuffled through her files. Amari watched her carefully. She was preparing for a counterattack, and he needed to be ready. The recess ended, and the courtroom filled once more. Judge Prescott returned to his seat, his robes billowing slightly as he adjusted himself on the bench. He tapped his gavel, silencing the room. "This court is now back in session," he announced. His gaze landed on Amari. "Mr. Taylor, the floor is yours. If you have further evidence to present, I suggest you do so now." Amari rose, his movements measured but confident. "Thank you, Your Honor," he began. He walked toward the evidence table, carrying another folder. "Before the recess, I presented proof of the irregularities surrounding the zoning changes and the subsequent evictions. Now, I'd like to address the human impact of these actions in a way that underscores their illegality." He opened the folder and removed a single piece of paper, holding it up for the court to see. "This is a copy of a contract signed by the developers with the City Council in 2010, he explained. "It explicitly states that the zoning protections for Eastwood Heights are to remain in place indefinitely unless overridden by a unanimous vote from the council, with public hearings held to ensure transparency." Prescott leaned forward, his expression hardening. "And are you suggesting that no such vote took place?" "I'm not suggesting, Your Honor," Amari replied. "I'm stating it as fact. The public records show no such vote, and the residents of Eastwood Heights were never informed of any hearings, because none were held." Hollis stood, her voice cutting through the room. "Objection, Your Honor. This so-called contract predates the current zoning adjustments. It's irrelevant to the case." Prescott raised a hand to silence her. "I'll allow it. Continue." Mr. Taylor Amari turned to face the gallery, his voice rising with conviction. "This contract is more than a piece of paper. It's a promise, a legal promise, that the city made to the residents of Eastwood Heights. A promise that was broken in secret, behind closed doors by people who thought no one would notice. But we noticed. And now this court has a chance to set things right." The gallery buzzed with murmurs, the tension in the room palpable. Prescott tapped his gavel again, restoring order. "Quiet in the gallery," he said sharply. Turning back to Amari, he added, "Mr. Taylor, you've made a compelling case, but I'll need to hear from the defense before proceeding further." Hollis stepped forward, her expression colder than ever. "Your Honor," she began, her tone clipped. "While Mr. Taylor has painted a dramatic picture, the facts remain the same. The evictions are legal under current zoning regulations. Whatever procedural oversights may have occurred are irrelevant to the legality of these notices." She paced slowly, her heels clicking against the floor. "Furthermore, the residents of Eastwood Heights were given ample time to relocate. My client has gone above and beyond to ensure a smooth transition, including offering financial assistance to those affected." Amari's jaw tightened, but he waited for his turn to respond. When Hollis finished, Prescott turned to him. "Mr. Taylor, do you have anything further to add?" Amari stepped forward, his voice steady but impassioned. "Yes, Your Honor. The so-called financial assistance Ms. Hollis mentioned was a pittance compared to the true cost of uprooting these families. Many of them were offered less than 3 months' rent in compensation, barely enough to secure housing in this city's inflated market." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But more importantly, Your Honor, the law is clear. If the zoning changes were made illegally, then everything that followed is invalid, including the evictions." Prescott sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Very well," he said finally. "This court will take the matter under advisement. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning for closing arguments." As the courtroom emptied once more, Amari felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. The finish line was in sight, but the final stretch would be the hardest yet. He gathered his files and stepped out into the hallway, where the residents of Eastwood Heights waited anxiously. He met their eyes, offering a quiet nod of reassurance. The fight wasn't over, but he wasn't done fighting. The night before the final arguments, Amari sat alone in his modest apartment, the city's muted hum filtering in through the cracked window. His desk was cluttered with documents, yellowed legal books, and a cup of coffee gone cold hours ago. The clock on the wall ticked incessantly, a constant reminder of the time slipping away. Despite the weight of the day's events, Amari's focus never wavered. He knew tomorrow would define not only the outcome of the case, but also the future of a community that had placed its faith in him. Amari leaned back in his chair, exhaustion tugging at his every muscle, and allowed his mind to drift. Memories of his childhood came flooding back, the sound of his grandmother's voice, thick with the same accent the judge had mocked, telling him stories of perseverance and pride. He thought of the nights he'd spent in that small library with Mr. Jameson, the retired lawyer who had taken him under his wing. "The law is like a maze," Mr. Jameson had said, his voice low and gravelly. "It's designed to confuse people like us, to make us think we don't belong here. But if you learn how it works, Amari, you can find the way out and bring others with you." Those words had carried him through law school, through countless nights of self-doubt, and now through this case. He opened his briefcase and pulled out the photograph of himself as a boy sitting beside Mr. Jameson. The edges were worn, and the ink had faded, but the memory it held was vivid. Amari traced the lines of the photo with his finger, drawing strength from it. Before he could sink too deeply into reflection, his phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from Mrs. Jenkins. "We're praying for you, Mr. Taylor. Whatever happens tomorrow, thank you for fighting for us." Amari smiled faintly, his resolve hardening. He couldn't let them down. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Word of the case had spread, and journalists now dotted the gallery, their cameras and notepads ready to capture every moment. Amari entered the room to the quiet hum of anticipation. The residents of Eastwood Heights filled the benches, their faces a mix of nervousness and hope. Mrs. Jenkins gave him a small wave and he nodded back, his expression calm despite the storm brewing inside. Judge Prescott entered, his gavel striking sharply as the room fell silent. "This court is now in session," he announced. His eyes swept across the room, lingering on Amari for a fraction longer than usual. "We will now hear closing arguments. Mr. Taylor, you may proceed." Amari stood, his every movement deliberate as he approached the center of the room. He placed his hands on the podium, pausing for a moment to collect his thoughts before speaking. "Your Honor, members of the court," he began, his voice steady. "This case is about more than technicalities or procedures. It's about justice. It's about a promise made to the residents of Eastwood Heights and enshrined in law that their homes, their lives, would be protected." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The defense has argued that these evictions are legal, that the developers followed the necessary steps. But the evidence shows otherwise. The zoning changes that led to these evictions were pushed through in secret, without the knowledge or consent of the people most affected. This is not just a violation of procedure, it is a violation of trust." Amari turned to face the gallery, his voice growing stronger. "For generations, the residents of Eastwood Heights have built lives in this community. They've raised families, supported each other, and created something that goes beyond property lines. The law exists to protect them, not to serve the interests of those with power and money." He turned back to the judge, his gaze unwavering. "Your Honor, the developers broke the law, and they did so knowing that the people they were displacing would have little means to fight back. But today, this court has the opportunity to show that justice is not reserved for the privileged. It is for everyone." The room was silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone present. Amari stepped back, his hands trembling slightly as he returned to his seat. He glanced at Mrs. Jenkins, who gave him a nod, her expression filled with quiet gratitude. Judge Prescott's gaze shifted to Margaret Hollis. "Ms. Hollis, you may proceed with your closing arguments." Hollis stood, her expression as sharp and composed as ever. But there was a tension in her movements that hadn't been there before. "Your Honor," she began, her voice measured, "while Mr. Taylor's passion is commendable, the law is clear. The zoning adjustments were approved by the appropriate authorities, and the eviction notices are legally binding. This court cannot make decisions based on emotion or sentiment. It must follow the law as it stands." She paced slowly, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "The developers have acted in good faith, offering financial assistance and time for the residents to relocate. While the situation may be unfortunate, it is not unlawful. The law does not exist to preserve sentiment. It exists to preserve order." She returned to her seat, her face a mask of confidence. Prescott nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Ms. Hollis," he said. "This court will adjourn for deliberation. A decision will be announced shortly." The gavel struck again, and the courtroom erupted into whispers as Prescott stood and exited. Amari sat back, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The wait had begun, and with it came the weight of everything that was at stake. As the residents gathered around him, offering words of encouragement, Amari remained quiet, his focus unwavering. Whatever the outcome, he knew he had given everything he had. Now, all he could do was wait. The courtroom was a hive of restless anticipation as everyone waited for Judge Prescott's return. Amari sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, his fingers interlaced and resting on the surface. Around him, the residents of Eastwood Heights murmured in low tones, their anxiety palpable. Some clutched hands tightly, while others cast nervous glances at the doors through which Prescott would soon re-enter. Amari felt the pressure mounting, a heavy knot of tension sitting in his chest, but he kept his breathing slow and steady. This wasn't just about him. It never had been. He glanced toward the defense table where Margaret Hollis was reviewing her notes one last time, her expression cool but visibly strained. The confident facade she'd worn throughout the trial had begun to crack ever so slightly. Her client, the lead developer, sat stiffly beside her, his face a mask of feigned composure. Amari caught the brief exchange of whispers between them and knew that, for the first time, doubt was creeping into their camp. The door to the judge's chambers opened and the room fell instantly silent. Prescott entered, his robes billowing as he took his seat behind the bench. His face was unreadable, the stern mask of impartiality betraying nothing of the deliberations that had just taken place. He tapped his gavel once, the sound echoing like a drumbeat through the courtroom. "This court has reviewed all evidence and arguments presented," Prescott began, his voice steady and deliberate. "I'd like to commend both parties for their thorough and passionate representation of their respective cases. However, the time has come for a ruling." Amari's heart pounded as he sat up straighter, his focus locked entirely on the judge. He caught sight of Mrs. Jenkins in the gallery, her hands clenched so tightly around her purse that her knuckles were white. The tension in the room was suffocating, the kind that stretched seconds into what felt like hours. Prescott continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "This case raises questions not only about the specifics of zoning laws, but also about the broader principles of justice and fairness. The defense has argued that the evictions are legally sound under the current zoning regulations. However, the plaintiff has presented compelling evidence that these zoning changes were made without proper procedure, undermining the very foundation upon which the evictions were justified." A murmur rippled through the gallery, quickly silenced by a sharp rap of Prescott's gavel. Amari's breath caught in his throat as the judge leaned forward, his voice heavy with finality. "This court finds that the procedural violations committed during the zoning adjustments invalidate the legitimacy of the eviction notices. As such, the court rules in favor of the plaintiff. The eviction notices are hereby nullified." The room erupted into stunned silence before a wave of cheers and cries of relief swept through the gallery. Mrs. Jenkins let out a sob, her frail hands trembling as she clung to the arm of a younger woman beside her. Other residents hugged one another, their faces alight with emotions that ranged from disbelief to pure joy. Amari sat frozen for a moment, the weight of the ruling sinking in. Then, as the reality of the victory settled over him, he exhaled deeply, a small, triumphant smile spreading across his face. He turned to the residents, nodding in quiet acknowledgement of their trust in him. This wasn't just his win, it was theirs. Prescott banged his gavel again, calling the room to order. "Let me be clear," he said, his tone cutting through the celebration. "This ruling is not a blanket condemnation of the developer's actions, nor is it a license to disregard the law. It is a reminder that even the most powerful must adhere to the rules and principles that govern us all." He turned his gaze toward Margaret Hollis, whose composure had finally shattered. Her jaw tightened and she busied herself packing up her files, her client visibly fuming beside her. Prescott addressed her directly. "Ms. Hollis, I suggest you advise your client to review their practices moving forward. This court takes such procedural violations very seriously." "Yes, Your Honor," Hollis replied, her voice clipped. She didn't look at Amari as she stood and walked briskly out of the courtroom, her client trailing behind her. Prescott's gaze softened slightly as he looked at Amari. "Mr. Taylor, your dedication to your clients and the law is commendable. This court hopes to see more advocates like you who are willing to fight for justice." "Thank you, Your Honor," Amari replied, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. The judge stood, signaling the end of the session, and exited the room. The courtroom erupted once more, the cheers and celebrations spilling over into the aisles. Amari was immediately surrounded by the residents, their voices overlapping in a chorus of gratitude. "You saved us," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice breaking as she clasped his hands. "You saved our homes, our lives. Thank you, Mr. Taylor." Amari smiled, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "No, Mrs. Jenkins. You all saved yourselves. You never stopped fighting, even when the odds were against you. I just helped make sure your voices were heard." The crowd began to spill out of the courtroom, their spirits high as they made their way back to Eastwood Heights. Amari lingered for a moment, watching them leave, their hope restored. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to relax, to bask in the victory. But deep down, he knew this was only one battle in a larger war. There were still so many others who needed someone to fight for them. As he gathered his things and prepared to leave, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out the photograph of himself and Mr. Jameson one last time. "This one's for you," he whispered, slipping it back into place. With renewed determination, Amari walked out of the courtroom, ready for whatever came next. As Amari stepped out into the sunlight, the crowd from the courtroom spilled onto the courthouse steps, their voices a mixture of jubilant cheers and heartfelt conversations. The energy was electric, a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped them only moments earlier. Reporters swarmed the steps, microphones and cameras at the ready, eager to capture the story of a small community's triumph against a powerful developer. Amari adjusted his tie and tried to make his way through the crowd, but the residents of Eastwood Heights surrounded him, their gratitude pouring out in an unrelenting tide. Mrs. Jenkins, with tears streaking her weathered cheeks, clutched his arm and said, "I told my grandson about you. I told him you were going to change everything. And you did." Amari smiled warmly, bending slightly to meet her gaze. "You give me too much credit, Mrs. Jenkins. This victory belongs to all of us. You trusted me when it wasn't easy. That's what made this possible." The sound of a camera shutter clicking pulled him back to the larger crowd. A young reporter in a sharp blazer thrust a microphone in his direction. "Mr. Taylor, can we get a statement? How does it feel to take down such a powerful corporation on behalf of these residents?" Amari hesitated, his mind swimming with emotions he couldn't yet untangle. But he composed himself quickly, knowing this was an opportunity to speak not just for Eastwood Heights, but for every community fighting to be seen. "It feels like justice," he said, his voice strong despite the exhaustion tugging at him. This case wasn't just about zoning laws or eviction notices. It was about people. It was about a community that was overlooked and underestimated, standing up and saying, "We matter. This is their victory, not mine." The reporter leaned in, pressing. "What do you hope this ruling will mean for other communities facing similar challenges?" Amari glanced over his shoulder at the residents celebrating behind him. "I hope it sends a message," he said, "that no matter how small you feel, no matter how powerful the forces against you might seem, the law is meant to protect everyone, and when people come together to fight for what's right, they can make a difference." Another round of cheers erupted from the crowd, and Amari was swept up in their celebration. He allowed himself a brief moment to revel in their joy before stepping aside to give them the spotlight. This wasn't his story, after all. It was theirs. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the city, Amari found himself walking through the streets of Eastwood Heights. The neighborhood was alive with celebration. Children played on the sidewalks, their laughter echoing through the air, while families gathered on porches, sharing food and stories. The once heavy air of uncertainty and despair had been replaced with a palpable sense of hope. Amari stopped in front of Mrs. Jenkins's house, her modest home a symbol of everything they had fought to protect. She sat on the porch, a steaming cup of tea in her hands, watching the children play. When she saw Amari, she waved him over with a smile. "Come on up, Mr. Taylor," she said warmly. "You've earned yourself a little rest." Amari climbed the steps, the creak of the wooden boards beneath his feet a comforting reminder of the home's history. He took a seat beside her, the cool evening breeze carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the garden. For a moment, they sat in silence, watching the neighborhood come alive around them. "You know," Mrs. Jenkins said after a while, her voice soft, "when I got that eviction notice, I thought it was over. I thought they were going to take everything we'd built here, and there was nothing we could do to stop it." Amari turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You didn't give up, though. Even when it felt impossible, you stood your ground. That's why we won." She chuckled, shaking her head. "Maybe, but we needed someone like you to show us how to fight, someone who believed in us when we didn't believe in ourselves." Amari looked out at the street, at the families laughing and celebrating together. "Sometimes it just takes one voice," he said quietly. "One voice to remind people they're not alone." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her eyes glistening. "Well, you were that voice for us, Mr. Taylor, and we won't forget it." As the night deepened, Amari stayed on the porch, listening to the sounds of the community he had helped save. It was a rare, quiet moment of peace, a reminder of why he had chosen this path in the first place. But in the back of his mind, he knew the fight wasn't over. There were still more communities out there, more people facing the same struggles. For now, though, he let himself savor this victory, knowing it was the first of many steps toward a better, fairer world. The next morning, the air was crisp and the streets of Eastwood Heights were calm, as if the neighborhood itself was exhaling after the storm. Amari woke early, his body still aching from the weight of the trial, but his mind sharp. He had barely slept, but there was a quiet satisfaction in his exhaustion, like the kind that follows a marathon well run. After breakfast, he stepped outside and found his way to a small park at the heart of the neighborhood. The park was modest but vibrant, its benches freshly painted, the playground full of children who no longer had to wonder if they'd have to leave their home. He saw Mrs. Jenkins there, seated on a bench with a group of other elderly residents, laughing and talking as they shared stories of their victory. She waved when she saw him, and he waved back, his steps quickening toward her. "Mr. Taylor," she called out, her voice bright with a joy he hadn't heard before. "You're up early. Figured you'd be sleeping after all the work you've been doing." Amari chuckled as he approached. "I don't think I could sleep even if I tried. Too much adrenaline, I guess." One of the other residents, a man in his 70s with a cane resting beside him, chimed in. "You've earned your rest, young man. What you did for us, well, there aren't words." Amari smiled, sitting down on the edge of the bench. "What we did," he corrected gently. "This was a team effort. You all stood up and showed the world what community looks like. That's more powerful than anything I could have done alone." The group nodded, and Mrs. Jenkins reached over to pat his hand. "You're a good man, Amari. We're lucky to have had you on our side." Just as he was about to respond, the sound of footsteps on gravel caught his attention. Turning, he saw a young man approaching, a teenager, maybe 17, with a notebook tucked under his arm and a determined expression on his face. His clothes were clean but worn, and his sneakers had clearly seen better days. There was something familiar about him, something that tugged at Amari's memory. "Mr. Taylor?" the boy asked hesitantly, stopping a few feet away. Amari stood and extended a hand, which the boy shook nervously. "That's me," Amari said, offering a warm smile. "How can I help you?" The boy hesitated, glancing at the group of elders before looking back at Amari. "I just wanted to say thank you for what you did for us, for my family." He paused, gripping the notebook tightly. "And I wanted to ask if you could give me some advice. I want to be a lawyer someday, like you." Amari blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in the boy's voice. For a moment, he saw a younger version of himself standing there, full of questions and hope but unsure of where to start. He gestured for the boy to sit down beside him on the bench. "What's your name?" Amari asked. "Darius," the boy replied, his voice steady despite his nerves. "Well, Darius, the first piece of advice I'll give you is this. Never let anyone tell you that you don't belong in this world, especially not in a courtroom. People might doubt you, but the law is a tool, and it belongs to everyone. Learn it, understand it, and use it to make a difference. Darius nodded, his grip on the notebook loosening slightly. That's what I want to do, make a difference, like you. Amari smiled again, his heart swelling with pride. Then you're already on the right track. Stay curious. Read everything you can. And when things get hard, and they will, remember why you started. Remember the people who are counting on you. Darius nodded again, this time with more confidence. Thank you, Mr. Taylor. I'll do my best. As the boy stood to leave, Mrs. Jenkins spoke up, her voice full of warmth. He'll do more than his best with someone like you guiding him, Amari. Amari watched as Darius walked away, his head held high, the notebook clutched to his chest like a shield. For a moment he sat in silence, letting the quiet pride of the moment wash over him. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was helping to inspire the next generation to take up the mantle. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Amari stood and bid farewell to the group, his mind already racing with plans for what came next. The victory for Eastwood Heights was just the beginning. There were other communities, other fights, and other Darius-like dreamers waiting for someone to believe in them. With each step he took through the neighborhood, past the homes he had helped save and the faces now filled with hope, Amari felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had found his calling, and it was bigger than any single case or courtroom. It was a movement, one voice at a time, building something that could last. As Amari walked back through the neighborhood, the streets now vibrant with life, he couldn't help but feel a sense of both accomplishment and responsibility. Every corner he turned, every wave or smile he received from the residents, reminded him of the weight of the trust they had placed in him. This wasn't just a legal victory. It was a promise he had made to a community, and he intended to keep it. Amari's phone buzzed in his pocket, jolting him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out to see an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. Normally, he would have let it go to voicemail, but something compelled him to answer. Amari Taylor speaking, he said, his voice steady but cautious. A woman's voice, sharp and professional, responded on the other end. Mr. Taylor, this is Vanessa Green. I'm a journalist with the Chronicle. I've been following the Eastwood Heights case closely, and I'd like to request an interview. Amari hesitated, glancing around the lively street. I appreciate your interest, Ms. Green, but I'm not sure an interview is necessary. The case speaks for itself. Her voice softened slightly, but it didn't lose its edge. With respect, Mr. Taylor, I don't think the public sees it that way. This case is bigger than one neighborhood. It's a story about justice, resilience, and the fight against systemic inequities. People need to hear it, and they need to hear it from you. Amari paused, weighing her words. He had never been one for the spotlight, preferring to let his work speak for itself. But Vanessa was right. This wasn't just about Eastwood Heights anymore. If their story could inspire others to stand up and fight for their communities, then maybe it was worth telling. All right, he said finally. Let's do it. But this isn't just about me. If we're doing this, I want the residents of Eastwood Heights to have a voice too. They're the heart of this story. Vanessa's tone brightened, her enthusiasm evident. Of course. I'll coordinate with you to set up a time. Thank you, Mr. Taylor. I think this is going to make a real impact. As the call ended, Amari tucked his phone back into his pocket, his mind already racing with the possibilities. An interview could amplify the message of the case, but it also meant stepping into a role he hadn't fully anticipated, that of a public figure, a symbol of something bigger than himself. The following week, the interview took place in the heart of Eastwood Heights, on the very steps of the courthouse where the ruling had been made. Vanessa arrived with her team, her sharp eyes scanning the scene as she prepared her questions. Amari stood with Mrs. Jenkins and several other residents, each of them dressed in their Sunday best, ready to tell their stories. The interview began with Vanessa directing her questions to Amari, asking about his journey, his motivations, and the challenges he faced during the trial. He answered thoughtfully, his words carefully chosen to highlight the importance of the community's role in the victory. What kept you going when the odds were against you? Vanessa asked, leaning forward slightly. Amari glanced at Mrs. Jenkins, whose eyes shone with quiet pride, and then back at Vanessa. "The people," he said simply. "When you meet people who are fighting for their homes, their families, their futures, it gives you strength. You realize that the fight isn't just about laws or courtrooms, it's about humanity. That's what kept me going." Vanessa nodded, clearly moved, and then turned her attention to Mrs. Jenkins and the other residents. One by one, they shared their stories. The fear they felt when the eviction notices arrived, the disbelief that anyone would fight for them, and the hope that blossomed when Amari took on their case. Mrs. Jenkins's voice wavered with emotion as she spoke. "When we thought we'd lost everything, Mr. Taylor showed us that we still had a voice. He reminded us that we mattered, and that made all the difference." The interview concluded with Vanessa asking Amari one final question. "What do you want people to take away from this case?" Amari looked directly into the camera, his expression resolute. "I want people to know that no matter how powerless they feel, they can make a difference. The law can be a weapon or a shield. It depends on who's wielding it. My hope is that this case inspires others to stand up, to fight for what's right, and to never let anyone tell them they don't belong." As the crew packed up their equipment and the residents mingled on the courthouse steps, Vanessa approached Amari privately. "You know," she said, her tone softer now, "you're not just a lawyer anymore. You're a leader. People are going to look to you now." Amari smiled faintly, his gaze drifting to the residents. "If that means I can keep helping people like them, then I'm okay with that." Vanessa nodded, extending her hand. "I think you're going to make a bigger impact than you realize, Mr. Taylor. Good luck." As she walked away, Amari stood for a moment, watching the residents of Eastwood Heights laughing and talking, their voices filled with a hope that hadn't been there before. He knew Vanessa was right. This case was just the beginning and he had a long road ahead. But for now, he allowed himself a moment to appreciate the victory and the new sense of purpose it had given him. In the weeks following the victory, the story of Eastwood Heights spread far beyond the city. News outlets ran headlines celebrating the triumph of a small, determined community against a powerful developer. Social media buzzed with praise for Amari Taylor, branding him a modern-day David who had taken on Goliath and won. While the newfound attention was overwhelming at times, Amari kept his focus on what mattered, ensuring the community's needs were met now that the legal battle was over. Amari returned to Eastwood Heights regularly, not as a lawyer but as a trusted ally. He helped residents navigate the bureaucratic hurdles that followed the ruling, ensuring their rights were protected as the city council scrambled to revise its policies. Each visit reinforced his connection to the neighborhood and deepened his resolve to keep fighting for justice wherever it was needed. One day, as Amari walked through the neighborhood, he noticed a group of teenagers gathered near the park, their voices animated. Among them was Darius, the boy who had approached him after the trial. Darius waved him over, his face lighting up with excitement. "Mr. Taylor," Darius called, jogging over to meet him. "We're working on something and I want you to see it." Curious, Amari followed Darius to a small community center near the edge of the park. Inside, a group of young people was busy organizing stacks of flyers, jotting down notes on a whiteboard, and discussing ideas with an energy that reminded Amari of his own early days. The room was filled with the hum of determination, and Amari couldn't help but smile. "What's all this?" he asked, looking around. Darius beamed with pride. "It's a youth advocacy group. We're calling it Voices of Eastwood. We want to make sure our generation knows how to stand up for ourselves and for our community. You inspired us, Mr. Taylor." Amari felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at the eager faces around the room. This is incredible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "What you're doing here is powerful. You're taking what we fought for and building something that will last." Darius nodded, his expression serious. "We want to learn, not just about laws and rights, but about how to organize, how to make our voices heard. Will you help us?" Amari paused, overwhelmed by the weight of the request. He looked around the room, seeing not just potential but a spark of something much bigger. These young people weren't just reacting to their circumstances. They were preparing to lead. "I'd be honored to help," Amari said finally. "But this is your movement. My job is to guide you, to make sure you have the tools you need. The rest is up to you." The room erupted in cheers, and Darius clapped him on the back. "Thank you, Mr. Taylor. We're going to make you proud." In the weeks that followed, Amari worked closely with Voices of Eastwood, leading workshops on community organizing, public speaking, and the basics of law. He helped them draft proposals to present to the city council, demanding increased transparency and stronger protections for vulnerable neighborhoods. The group's passion and determination reignited Amari's own sense of purpose, reminding him why he had chosen this path in the first place. But it wasn't just Eastwood Heights that was taking notice. Emails began flooding into Amari's office, messages from communities across the city and even the state asking for his help. They had seen what he had done for Eastwood Heights and wanted to know if he could do the same for them. One evening, as Amari sat in his office reviewing case files, his assistant Lena knocked on the door and stepped inside. "You've got another request," she said, holding up a thick envelope. "This one's from a community in Lincoln Heights. They're dealing with predatory landlords and they've heard about your work." Amari leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The requests were piling up faster than he could respond, and while he wanted to help everyone, he knew he couldn't do it alone. "Lena, schedule a meeting with them," he said after a moment. "But also start compiling a list of lawyers and advocates who might be willing to partner with us. If we're going to make a real difference, we need a bigger network." Lena nodded, her expression one of quiet admiration. "You're building something here, Amari. It's bigger than you realize." As she left the room, Amari looked out the window at the city skyline. Lena was right. What had started as a single case was now growing into something much larger. He had always believed in the power of the law to create change, but now he saw the power of people, ordinary people banding together to fight for their rights. Amari took a deep breath, feeling the familiar mix of exhaustion and determination settle over him. The road ahead was long, but he was ready. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a movement, one that would continue to grow as long as there were voices willing to rise. Months passed, and the momentum surrounding Amari's work continued to build. What had begun as a fight for Eastwood Heights had now evolved into a citywide movement. Through workshops, town halls, and advocacy meetings, Amari and his growing network of allies provided tools for communities to reclaim their rights and hold those in power accountable. Neighborhoods once isolated and silenced were now forming coalitions, amplifying their collective voices to demand change. One evening, Amari found himself standing in a packed community center on the other side of the city. The room buzzed with energy. Residents of Lincoln Heights gathered to discuss their strategy against predatory landlords. A woman named Rosa Alvarez, a single mother who had become a de facto leader in her community, stood at the front of the room. Her passion was undeniable, and her voice carried the conviction of someone who had seen enough injustice and was ready to fight back. "We've been ignored for too long," Rosa said, her eyes sweeping across the room. "Our homes are falling apart while landlords raise rents. They're betting on us giving up, but we're here to show them we won't back down." The crowd erupted in applause, their determination palpable. Amari watched from the back of the room, feeling a surge of pride as he saw the fire in their eyes. This was what it was all about, people stepping into their power, realizing they had the right to demand better. When Rosa finished speaking, she gestured for Amari to join her at the front. The crowd quieted as he stepped forward, his presence alone commanding attention. He looked out at the sea of faces, each one carrying its own story of struggle and resilience. "I don't have to tell you what you're up against," Amari began, his voice calm but firm. "You've lived it. You've felt the weight of systems designed to push you out, to make you believe you don't belong. But you're here tonight because you know that's not true. You do belong, and together you have the power to make them see that." He paused, letting his words settle before continuing. "The fight won't be easy. They'll try to divide you, to wear you down, to make you feel like this is a losing battle. But let me tell you something I've learned. When people stand together, when they refuse to back down, even the biggest obstacles can fall. Another round of applause rippled through the room, and Rosa leaned over to whisper, "They trust you, Amari. We all do." After the meeting, Amari stayed behind to speak with residents one-on-one, listening to their stories and answering their questions. As the room began to empty, Rosa approached him with a cup of coffee and a determined expression. "Can I ask you something?" she said, handing him the cup. "Of course," Amari replied, taking a sip. "How do you keep going?" she asked. "You've seen how hard this is. Doesn't it ever feel like it's too much?" Amari considered her question carefully, his gaze drifting to the window where the city lights twinkled in the darkness. "There are days when it feels overwhelming," he admitted, "when it feels like no matter how much we fight, the system keeps pushing back. But then I think about the people we're fighting for, people like you, like Darius, like Mrs. Jenkins. I think about the victories we've already won, and I remember that every step forward, no matter how small, matters." Rosa nodded, her expression softening. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," Amari said with a faint smile, "but it's worth it." That night, as Amari walked back to his car, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from a grassroots organization in another city, asking for his help with a similar housing issue. He stared at the message for a moment, the weight of the request settling on him. The scope of what he had started was expanding faster than he could have imagined. When he arrived home, he sat at his desk and opened his laptop. The list of communities requesting his assistance had grown to dozens, each one representing a unique battle, but echoing the same struggles. He couldn't do it all alone. Not anymore. The next morning, Amari called a meeting with his team, now larger and more diverse than it had ever been. Lawyers, activists, organizers, and volunteers filled the room, each one committed to the cause. "We've accomplished a lot," Amari said, addressing the group. "But we're just getting started. This fight isn't about one case or one neighborhood. It's about building a system where justice isn't a privilege. To do that, we need to work together, to empower communities to fight for themselves, and to create a network that can't be ignored." The room erupted in agreement, their collective resolve unshaken. Amari felt a spark of hope reignite in his chest. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a movement growing stronger with every passing day. Together they would carry the torch of justice forward, illuminating paths for those who had been left in the dark for too long. Months turned into a year, and Amari Taylor's name became synonymous with community-driven justice. His office had expanded into a network of regional hubs, each one staffed with lawyers, advocates, and volunteers who shared his vision. The victories began to pile up, not just in courtrooms, but in city council chambers, neighborhood meetings, and even at the state level. The movement had grown into something undeniable, a wave of change driven by everyday people who refused to be silenced. One late afternoon, as Amari prepared to leave his office, Lena entered with a folder in her hand. "You've got a letter," she said, setting it down on his desk. "It's from a professor at Southern University. Apparently they've been following your work." Amari raised an eyebrow and opened the envelope, curious. Inside was a formal letter from the university's law school, inviting him to deliver the keynote address at their upcoming graduation ceremony. As he read, a small smile crept across his face. Southern University was his alma mater, the place where he had first started dreaming of a career in law. To be invited back as a speaker felt surreal, like his journey had come full circle. "You going to do it?" Lena asked, watching his reaction. "Yeah," Amari said, setting the letter down. "I think I will." The day of the ceremony arrived, and Amari stood backstage, listening to the hum of the crowd. The graduates, clad in their caps and gowns, filled the auditorium with an air of excitement and anticipation. Amari glanced at his notes, but he already knew what he wanted to say. This wasn't just a speech. It was an opportunity to share everything he had learned, everything that had shaped him, with the next generation of lawyers. When his name was announced, The room erupted in applause. Amari stepped onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding him as he approached the podium. He looked out at the crowd, at the sea of young faces filled with hope and ambition, and took a deep breath. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady. "First, let me say how honored I am to stand here today. This moment isn't just about celebrating your achievements. It's about celebrating the potential you hold to shape the future." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room. "When I first started my career, I thought justice was about knowing the law and applying it. And while that's important, I've learned that justice is about more than rules and regulations. It's about people. It's about listening to their stories, understanding their struggles, and fighting for those who can't fight for themselves." The room was silent, the graduates hanging on his every word. "You're stepping into a world that is often unfair, a system that wasn't built to protect everyone equally. But you have the power to change that. You have the tools, the knowledge, and most importantly, the choice to stand up for what's right." Amari's voice grew stronger, filled with conviction. "Don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong in the room. Don't let anyone make you doubt your worth or your ability to make a difference. The law can be a shield or a weapon. Use it wisely and always remember who you're fighting for." As he finished, the room erupted into a standing ovation. Amari stepped back from the podium, his heart full as he watched the graduates rise to their feet. He could see the spark in their eyes, the same one he had once carried, and he knew they would go on to do extraordinary things. Later that evening, as he walked through the quiet campus, Amari found himself drawn to the old law library. The building hadn't changed much since his student days, its towering shelves still filled with dusty volumes of legal texts. He wandered through the aisles until he found a small table in the corner, the same one where he had spent countless nights studying, dreaming, and wondering if he would ever make a difference. He sat down and pulled out a notebook, scribbling a few thoughts as they came to him. The past year had been a whirlwind, but moments like this reminded him of where it all began. He thought about Eastwood Heights, about Mrs. Jenkins and Darius and Rosa, and about the countless people whose lives had intersected with his own. Their stories were what kept him going, what made the fight worth it. As he closed the notebook and stood to leave, a young student approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Taylor?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with awe. "I just wanted to say, your work inspires me. I hope I can do what you've done someday." Amari smiled, his voice warm. "You already have everything you need. Just remember, it starts with one voice." The student nodded, her face lighting up with determination as she walked away. Amari lingered for a moment, letting the quiet of the library envelop him. Then he stepped outside into the cool evening air, the stars above shining brightly, as if reminding him that the work was far from over. And that was just the way he wanted it. Amari Taylor stood on the courthouse steps once more, the quiet hum of the city enveloping him. It had been a long journey, one filled with victories, setbacks, and lessons that shaped not just his career, but his very sense of purpose. He had learned that justice wasn't a single moment or a courtroom decision. It was a collective effort, a movement powered by people who refused to be silenced. Looking back, he saw that his work wasn't just about winning cases. It was about giving people like Mrs. Jenkins and Darius the courage to fight for themselves. It was about turning doubt into determination and fear into hope. Amari had realized that the law wasn't a weapon meant to oppress, but a tool to empower, and his life's mission had become teaching others how to wield it. As he watched a young boy playing on the sidewalk, laughing without a care, Amari smiled. The fight wasn't over, it never would be, but the spark he had ignited would continue to grow, passed from one person to the next. His legacy wasn't the cases he won, but the lives he touched. And with that knowledge, Amari walked forward, ready for whatever battles lay ahead.